Welcome back again. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is day 3, and our topic in this live forum series, organizing American Muslims organizing around our issues for 2021. We're going to be talking about Islamophobia, disinformation campaigns, and voting rights. Since 2016, it probably existed before that, but a lot of awareness has been brought to our attention about disinformation campaigns, especially with Islamophobia against Muslims, and in terms of voting rights and elections. So we have a great panel of speakers tonight to share this information with you. And what I will do is each speaker will have about 5 to 7 minutes, 7 to 8 minutes, I would say, to speak in the first half of the program. In the second half of the program, we will follow up with questions that we get from the audience and continue the discussion. So the first person that I would like to introduce is Aysha Khan. Aisha is a fellow with the GroundTruth Project. She is a freelance reporter, mostly with Religion News Service, as well as a student at Harvard Divinity School. Aisha is a Boston-based reporter covering U.S. Muslims for Religion News Service and other outlets. She is a Preserving Democracy Fellow with the GroundTruth Project. Welcome, Aisha.
Thanks for having me. Salam, everybody. So I wanted to just give a little bit of a broader overview on some of the voting rights issues affecting Muslims. I spent the past few months with the GroundTruth Project looking at how voting rights issues affect diverse Muslim communities across the US and how Muslims are responding and trying to expand voter access. So my initial thought when I was going into that fellowship was to write one broad article looking at the issue of voting rights for Muslims, but I very quickly realized there are so many facets to this issue. Each of them is so complex. But there are a few major strands that I wanted to point out to you all and just introduce you to. The first one I want to bring up is disenfranchisement related to the carceral system. So Islam is the fastest growing religion in the penal system. So the issue of felony disenfranchisement is obviously very important for Muslim communities, particularly Black Muslim communities. But even in states where convicted felons do regain their right to vote after they serve their sentence and complete their parole or probation, there is still the issue of voting rights for people in local jails. So most of the nearly 800,000-ish people held in local jails across the country never actually lose the right to vote, since they're just awaiting trial or are convicted on misdemeanors. But many people don't realize that they actually have that right to vote because of these felony disenfranchisement laws and a lot of misinformation about what their rights are. So that means many of them think they cannot vote. And even if they are aware that they can vote, sheriffs and correctional officers and people within the facilities often have very little interest in making it easy for them to vote. So I've been talking to people, especially in California, where it is legal for convicted felons to vote after they serve their sentence. Even for people in local jails there, it's very difficult for them to receive their ballots. I'm hearing from folks that they still haven't received them, and in previous years they've received them days after the election has actually passed. So that's a major issue that some Muslims, especially in San Diego, we have Pillars of the Community. You're going to learn more about them in tomorrow's program, I believe. They've been working on this issue a lot. I also wanted to bring up some issues specific to immigrants. One of them is naturalization. USCIS is still working through a massive backlog of potential citizens, especially due to the pandemic and USCIS offices closing down for a period of time. So naturalization ceremonies and interviews were actually delayed due to those closures, and USCIS didn't allow any sort of remote options, even though there was some fairly widespread bipartisan support for such remote options. So it looks like about 300,000 immigrants are actually going to lose their chance to vote this November, who otherwise would have probably been able to if the pandemic hadn't happened, or if a remote option had been available for naturalization. And that's really unfortunate, especially because naturalized citizens actually tend to vote more on average than born citizens. And then here in Massachusetts, for example, we've had an issue where USCIS actually incorrectly told hundreds of newly sworn in citizens that they cannot vote in November's elections once the voter registration deadline passed, when actually Massachusetts law does have a provision which would allow them to register to vote even after the deadline has passed. And so there are several people, or there are hundreds of people who have been affected by that and potentially may not be able to vote as a result of that misinformation. There's also the issue of denaturalization, which people aren't really paying attention to. But the Trump administration has been reviewing thousands of cases of naturalized citizens, sometimes related to previous deportation orders or fraud that, in some cases, these are longtime citizens who didn't even know about these orders in their past. And so that's been a major concern for a lot of activists. The other big issue that's coming up a lot is language. So activists and community leaders already have a very hard time getting the state to provide, these legally mandated translations when their population in, a county meets the legal standard set by the Voting Rights Act, Section 203. But they're also working to fill in the gaps with videos in many places. So a lot of these local organizations are doing translations in, Arabic, French, Sindhi, Kuchi, Gujarati, Bengali, or other languages of their local Muslim communities, and translating the language of the ballots as well as language of absentee ballot request forms. And they're also maybe setting up staffing hotlines where people can call if they, run into issues voting the day of. There also is a major effort to get diverse and multilingual poll workers, actually working on the day of the polls. It sets people at ease to just see people who are looking like them working at the polls. And it's even better if they can act as interpreters. And then there's also the question of the polling places themselves. Often these are in churches. We don't hear very often about polling places in mosques or in, say, the local Bengali community center. And then that brings me to the last issue, which is that of voter intimidation and outright voter suppression. So the first really alarming case that I want to bring to your attention, if you haven't already heard about this, happened in upstate New York very recently, where a local elected official filed objections against 200 absentee ballot requests during the June primaries. And then when a local election lawyer actually filed a Freedom of Information Act request about those ballots, hoping to get the names of the people whose ballots were invalidated, they found out that 199 out of those 200 names were visibly Muslim or Arab names. And so there's now a state attorney general probe into that. But, that's one case that we found out by happenstance. Hopefully there haven't been any others, but, that hasn't left a lot of Muslims feeling confident about the integrity of the elections. I also bring up some data from the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. In their exit polls from the 2016 elections, they found that about 46 of Muslim voters who responded to their polls were asked for identification, while only 32% of non-Muslim voters were asked for identification. And there were several incidents that they found where poll workers improperly asked Muslims who wore a hijab or niqab to show their ID. And some women who wore the niqab were also asked to show their faces. A lot of people were asked to prove their citizenship. Some were told that they couldn't vote for a myriad of reasons, but they were also not offered the provisional ballot, which they are supposed to be offered. And then we have the cases of voter intimidation, such as what we're seeing in Minnesota, where a private security company, Atlas Aegis, recently announced plans to hire and arm former veterans to stand guard outside polling places and protect against Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists. And Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, has since gotten an assurance from the company that they won't be doing that because it is illegal to do so. But, a lot of locals, especially the local Somali community, is a little bit nervous as a result about showing up at the elections. And The Intercept today actually just published an investigation into some other private security firms that may be doing similar things, recruiting for armed guards on the election day. I'll also bring up in Minnesota, President Trump himself has been amplifying debunked allegations that Representative Ilhan Omar and other elected Somali officials are involved in some sort of massive ballot harvesting scheme. And researchers from the Election Integrity Partnership recently described that video, which was filmed by Project Veritas, a very right-wing reactionary outlet. These researchers described it as a domestic, coordinated elite disinformation campaign, and local Muslims and Somali, community leaders are decrying it as an effort to, impugn the integrity of the Somali vote. And so a lot of these issues have left Muslims feeling a little bit nervous about their ability to vote, or whether their votes will actually matter the day of in the election. But there are a lot of interesting and creative initiatives happening across the country to try and counter these factors. Oh, Sala, it looks like you're muted right now.
Sorry. I said with the election only 2 days away, that doesn't give us a lot of confidence in the system, right? It's a very scary situation. We have to be aware of all of these facts. Thank you so much, Aisha, for sharing this information with us. Following Aisha, I'd like to introduce Thenmozhi Soundararajan. Sorry, Thenmozhi, I hope I am pronouncing that name correctly. She is the executive director of Equity Labs, and she's a Dalit American artist. Her work, of course, this is her work. This is what she does. So without, I don't want to get into too much of your introduction. I'll please introduce yourself more so, but I know that this is your work and this is the research and information that you do, a study that you do is in disinformation. So with that said, Thenmozhi, please take it away.
Sure, thank you, and welcome and hello, everybody. Again, my name is Thenmozhi Soundararajan, and I'm here with Equality Labs. And I really want to follow up and build on what Aisha was speaking to, which is that, in many ways, when we're looking at the Muslim vote and other BIPOC communities who are really struggling in terms of being able to access their democratic right to participate in this election, we have to really look at the problem of disinformation also being connected to attempts to deplatform ourselves from democracy so that our adversaries can in turn platform themselves. And, I think when we think about the beginning of the Trump administration in 2016, he ran on the Muslim ban, and that was his first delivery point when he first came into office. And I think we have to see these disinformation attacks like in the vein of his commitments to continually deplatform our communities. And for folks who are new to the conversation about disinformation, I think that it's really alarming when you see it in your own experience. And when we've talked with grassroots organizers and community members all across the United States, usually the way they experience this information might be through like a targeted Facebook ad or maybe a WhatsApp message. And there's luckily in this cycle been a lot of training as to know what to do. But I think there still is that internal instinct where you see something that's so wrong and it just like hurts you to the core about how violently they're shaping the narrative around our community, that people still attempt to engage with that disinformation. And I think what's really critical for people to know is that, disinformation is not a battle between facts. It's not like our facts and adversaries' facts. It's actually a battle about power. And I think what this is really teaching all of us is that, in such polarized and contested political environments, a fact is a fact not just because of evidence, but because of power. And fundamentally, the way that we are going to be able to stop disinformation about our communities is by building power, is by holding power, and also educating ourselves to the scourge that disinformation is, and being able to properly inoculate all of our institutions from it. And, I think that, one of the, the best example of this was the example that Aisha spoke about in Minnesota with the attacks on Representative Ilhan Omar, as well as the Black Muslim community and the larger Muslim community that was part of her, rise to power. And what's so interesting is that to be able to have a reflective democracy that gives us a representative like Ilhan Omar, we also need to have our bases strongly engaged in the electoral process. And that makes a ton of people incredibly unhappy. And so the way that disinformation works, it really works to intimidate, it works to build harassment, and it works to really make us confused so that we stay off of our goal of being, in terms of our goals towards building power. So I think what I want to really, encourage people who are seeing these kinds of tactics and campaigns is to, one, reach out to a trusted institution where you can report what you're seeing. Because in many of the cases where we're seeing disinformation, in order to prove what's going on, you need to be able to have some layer of forensics as well as advocacy in order to be able to stop it. And sometimes that might be reaching out in terms of like the Electoral Commission. Sometimes it might be advocacy with the platform. Sometimes it might be community mobilization, but we have a lot of tools as Muslim and South Asian and Arab communities that we have built specifically to be able to defend our truth and defend our community engagements. And I think that, what we've learned in this cycle is that we know how dirty our adversaries are going to be, and that for them, they do not care about the right of democracy. They only care about the corruption of them maintaining themselves in power. And so we have to have fortitude. We have to know that we have such talented people on our side, and we have to keep building community and open lines of communication around this. The other thing which I also wanted to flag for people is that disinformation also happens oftentimes with attacks of cybersecurity. And so if you are a Muslim organization or an institution that is finding itself at the heart of one of these campaigns, it's incredibly important that you also tighten up your digital security practices. Because oftentimes what we're seeing is the same actors that will put these disinformation narratives, they want to come after mosques, they want to come after community institutions and try to get into the file systems and the emails and target vulnerable staff, because that's a way for them to get more data to weaponize. And unfortunately, we've seen many, many cases like this around the country. And, I think that we have a greater awareness that these attacks are happening, but we still don't have the resilience, I think, that we need. And so for Muslim leaders that are, on this call or participating, we really want to encourage you to reach out to organizations like Equality Labs or another security provider in your space, because, you want to think of these two kind of twin evils of digital harassment and disinformation as the barriers to us being able to achieve our full democratic potential. And so when you see those attacks, we should not get discouraged, but we need to be firm in terms of building our resilience. And then the only other thing that I would like to say is that I think in this election cycle, we've seen lots of different kinds of bad actors going after the Muslim community. I think in addition to seeing right-wing actors like Project Veritas, as well as folks from the Zionist troll sphere, we've also seen Hindu nationalists go after many Muslim organizations in many down-ballot races. And again, I think with a lot of Muslim leaders, the targeting of it is very visceral and very triggering. And I think what's so important is that when you see a troll, remember, it's not about one-on-one engagements. We are not dealing in a symmetrical engagement with the folks that are targeting us. And in fact, it's you not against a person, but often, many, many different computer programs that might be operating in the form of bots. And so it's very important, the minute that you see something that feels fishy or doesn't feel accurate, or that you feel is wrong, most disinformation will be activated in terms of trying to make you act out of an emotion. And so I think it's very important for you to slow down, examine the content that you're seeing, and then if it feels inaccurate, reach out to a professional institution to be able to help manage it. Because like Aisha mentioned, it's often because someone reports something that doesn't feel right, or that we're able to uncover situations like where ballots are being discounted, or people are being told wrong information in terms of the vote. And so, there are many researchers right now participating to be able to build that evidence chain. And so we want to let each and every person that's watching to know you're not alone. Reach out, and we're here to defend and build and fight in this moment.
Thank you. That is such good information to share. We have to be so aware of everything, hypersensitive right now. So thank you for that. And speaking of the Hindu nationalist movement and Islamophobia, I want to introduce Eric, who is from Muslim Advocates. Eric Naing is Media Relations Officer for Muslim Advocates, and recently they did a report on the human cost of Facebook's disregard for Muslim life. And I believe that they were successful in getting one of the Facebook folks in India fired because of this, for enabling anti-Muslim hate. So Eric, please tell us a little bit more about what you all did and this report that you have created.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I want to say that Thenmozhi and so many other people did so much work too on the issue of Facebook. So she had, and Facebook India's office in particular. So she's also another great person to talk about this. On that issue, it's a very complicated thing. But basically, everything kind of comes down to Facebook having this global anti-Muslim problem. And the way that the platform is being used to threaten Muslims and enable hate and violence and even genocide against Muslims all around the world. It's a very wide-ranging subject. Tonight's issue about the elections and disinformation and voting rights also ties into this. One of the threads between all of these ideas is kind of the core way that anti-Muslim bigotry has been highlighted in American politics for nearly 20 years. Basically ever since 9/11 kicked off, nearly 2 decades of anti-Muslim hate and this kind of ugliness has been a part of our politics. We've seen watch lists, unconstitutional profiling and surveillance of Muslims, and purity tests about politicians, saying the phrase radical Islamic terror. They've all become a common part of our political discourse. And even under a Democratic White House, we saw discriminatory surveillance programs continue. We saw the rise of anti-Muslim politicians like Iowa's Steve King and New York's Peter King and others come to the fore. And then we saw Donald Trump. Again, as Thenmozhi said, Donald Trump made his name on anti-Muslim bigotry. Before he ever ran for president, he burst onto the political scene by peddling the false conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim. As a presidential candidate, he ran on a promise to enact a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And as president, one of his first acts in office, as we all know, was to enact the Muslim ban. And now, as we near the end of the 2020 campaign, President Trump is continuing to run on attacking Muslim refugees and attacking Muslim elected officials like Representative Ilhan Omar and Keith Ellison. And Muslim advocates, we've dealt with all these issues and more, and we will continue to until this hate and bigotry is ended for good. But as I said earlier, a major player in this discussion about Islamophobia and disinformation and voting rights is Facebook. Facebook is a huge part of our democracy now. It's a huge part of our politics now. And it has been since 2016 and before. Recent major news investigations just uncovered how the Trump campaign in 2016 used Facebook ads to target Black voters and other voters of color, including Muslims, to try and encourage them to sit out the election and not vote. Now in 2020, President Trump has run Facebook campaign ads scaremongering about Muslim immigrants, warning that, they're going to bring COVID and specifically attacking Somalis. He has also run ads on Facebook calling for a Trump army to show up at polling places. And now you're seeing this come to fruition where there are more and more reports of armed Trump supporters disrupting rival campaign events and acting as self-appointed poll watchers. It's a scary new reality that is threatening our democracy, and Facebook and other social media platforms have done so much to help enable them. So at Muslim Advocates, our concern for this election is hate speech, threat, and conspiracy theories and disinformation thriving on platforms like Facebook. One Muslim Advocates has worked on the US side, at least, to fight against anti-Muslim hate on Facebook for about 5 years. So one specific issue that we have worked on is how white nationalists and militia groups use Facebook event pages to threaten Muslims and other vulnerable communities. Muslim Advocates has been working with and complaining about Facebook since 2015, as I said. At that year, a notorious anti-Muslim bigot and militia supporter named John Ritzheimer used a Facebook event page to organize a hate rally targeting a mosque in Phoenix, Arizona. That event page encouraged the 600 people who RSVP'd to, quote, utilize Second Amendment right at this event, unquote. So like asking people to come and bring guns and threaten Muslims. American Muslims regularly face these kinds of threats and hate crimes, particularly at their houses of worship. And it's scary to see Facebook enable this to happen. So here was a man, Ritzheimer, associated with militias like the Oath Keepers and the One Percenters, telling 600 people to go harass and target this specific mosque and bring their guns. So after this happened, we went to Facebook to warn them and say, hey, your event pages are being used by white nationalists and militia groups to threaten and harm Muslims. And this would be the first of many times over the years where Facebook or Muslim Advocates would warn Facebook that something harmful on their platform was threatening Muslims, and for us to be given basically excuses, stalling tactics, and non-answers. This event page issue, we've seen it come to the fore again through the deadly consequences of Facebook's serial inaction in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Just a few months ago, Black Lives protesters took to the streets in the city following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. In response, Kyle Rittenhouse drove up from Illinois with a gun and joined up with a local militia group, the Kenosha Guard. And during a confrontation with two protesters, Rittenhouse shot and killed them. Shot and killed two people. Later, reporters found out that the Kenosha Guard used a Facebook event page to broadcast a call to arms. This event page was flagged at least 455 times to Facebook, but they didn't take it down. The horror in Kenosha is just one of the many ways that Facebook's failures to heed Muslim Advocates' warnings, Equality Lab's warnings, so many other people's warnings, failure to heed these warnings and to the death that has followed. Lives are at stake here. White nationalists in the US are using Facebook to target or to organize hate rallies in mosques. WhatsApp and Facebook are being used to foment mob violence in India. Facebook was used to enable a genocide in Myanmar, yet Facebook refuses to act. So as we said earlier, we just released a report called Complicit, The Human Cost of Facebook's Disregard for Human Life. And it's kind of a comprehensive look at how Facebook enables hate, violence, and genocide across Muslims around the world. Tonight I'm here to talk mainly about Facebook, but this is kind of a small slice of how our democracy is a threat because of this social media platform. We're seeing the company be weaponized by the Trump campaign to go after Muslims, to stir hatred against refugees and immigrant communities who are already experiencing hate crimes. So it's a very new and important thing that I'm hopeful we'll all be talking about more, but I really want to sound the alarms for. So thank you tonight for having me here to talk about it. And I'm very excited to hear the rest of the speakers as well. Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute again.
It's a friends and family social media platform, but it has become very political and so dangerous. It's enabling so much more horrible things right now. So we'll come back to you. We have lots of questions on that. Next, I would like to introduce Tahira Amatul Wadud. Tahira is an attorney. She's a community leader, progressive. Tahira ran in 2018 to unseat a Democratic incumbent, Richard Neal, in Massachusetts' 1st Congressional District. And I know that she has experienced a lot of fear-mongering, disinformation campaigns against her. And so I'd love for her to share her experience with us.
Thank you, Ghazala. And thank you to all of the panelists tonight. I'm listening to Thenmozhi and Eric talk about what they're seeing in their research has really validated what I've seen in my real life experience. And the first thing I want to mention is that Islamophobia has existed in this country before its inception. As we know, that the many of the enslaved Africans that were stolen and brought to this country, we know that about 30% of them were Muslim, and they were largely stripped of their identity to be Muslim and to practice Islam. And any policy that goes into effect that is Islamophobic in nature just simply is designed to protect white fragility and white supremacy. So I like to begin with Islamophobia is not a contemporary invention. It is existing long and is rooted in all sorts of racism. So there's two things that I'd like to share with you tonight in terms of my experience and to put some meat on the bones of what Thenmozhi and Eric also shared about what they're seeing from the use of social media platforms in order to promote Islamophobia and create dangerous existence for American Muslims. First, I have as a professional in my legal background, the work started for me and one of my colleagues named Tahira Clark, who was also a lawyer in upstate New York, as early as 2007. That's when we started writing cease and desist letters to news outlets, so-called news outlets that were promoting manufactured, created stories about the community of Islamburg, which is a small village upstate New York. It's home to a majority African-American Muslim community, having existed for about 30 years. So about in 2007, we noticed that there were these articles coming out on the internet that presented the community as a threat to safe and civilized society. Lots of rumors and lies and misinformation. And it was not just someone sitting at a computer. What we would later learn is that it was indeed a campaign. And it became totally disruptive, not only to the community itself, but to the neighbors and the neighborhood in which the Islamburg community resides. And so we would sit there and we would write cease and desist letters to organizations, one of them being the 700 Club, some of them being too vague to really identify. But the way that it started to manifest itself was that you'd see references to the community in like the comment sections online. And eventually it made its way into like mainstream media and even Fox News. And at the time when we couldn't quite name what was happening, we knew that it was wrong, but we couldn't understand why. We now know that Islamophobia, not only is it manufactured, not only is it a campaign, it is a well-funded campaign, right? Protection of white supremacy at all costs is on the agenda for enemies of America. Let's just face it. And so millions of dollars goes into targeting certain Muslim communities, certain Muslim people, as we've heard, to try to quiet and silence them and to promote the ideal a message of creating a moral and social villain in the American Muslim. And we have to reject that. Back to the story of Islamburg. So as we were dealing with this in a way that we were trying to, and at times it felt like drinking out of a water hose, right? It was so much, so often, and we could not figure it out. But by 2013, we filed a lawsuit actually against one blogger and his entire organization. We filed a defamation lawsuit in the federal court, and we warned the court that while we appreciate free speech, he has transcended the bounds of and transgressed the bounds of free speech into hate crimes. And most importantly, that if we didn't get a hold of stopping this defamatory and harmful publication of these materials, that eventually American Muslims would be hurt. American Muslims would be killed, is what we predicted. And our lawsuit ended up being dismissed on a technicality, but we hit back hard. It was definitely a David and Goliath strike, and we felt very successful. Unfortunately, we weren't successful enough because in 2015, what we had predicted manifested. Muslims started to die. Masajids were threatened and targeted, and the community of Islamburg again was threatened, this time by white wing militia. In the name, one of them was Robert Dogger. The other was John Ritzheimer, which Eric mentioned. And Ritzheimer had targeted Arizona, but he also targeted Islamburg. And again, here we are as a community full of children and kids and senior citizens. And these people are talking about they're going to come up there with guns, hand-to-hand combat. We were also informed that we could have been the target of chemical warfare by other militia. And also the common denominator here is that Facebook was the conduit through which these people promoted and shared and recruited allies in this horrific mission. I will spare you the story about, as a community, having to go from being vilified and demonized by law enforcement, which is what has happened to American Muslims, to now pushing the Department of Justice, local and state law enforcement, and making them recognize and honor us as victims, because it is hard for these people to understand that Muslims statistically are more likely to be victims than offenders, and that we have the identity of being victims and strong victims. And so while many Muslims around the country watched us struggle to tell our story and to defend ourselves, and the silence of our friends was deafening, we stood up and we did protest and press conferences and wrote our own articles and countered the Islamophobia and saved our lives. And we are confident that we saved the lives of many other Muslims around the country by being bold and encouraging others to do the same. Because one of the factors is that as African-American Muslims, we recognize our social capital. While we may not have wealth and resources and proximity to white privilege like other American Muslims might have, we have social capital and the ability to say that we built this country, we're not going anywhere, and we're not afraid of your threats to deport us. And so one of the most important things and lessons that has come from this is that Muslims do need to unite, because we all have something to bring to this fight. And it is a fight. The fight against the campaign of Islamophobia is a fight, and it requires all Muslims being hands on deck. As Ghazala mentioned, I did run for office in 2018, and I was in Breitbart at least twice, right? So when you're in Breitbart, you're just like, what is happening? But it's predictable, it's corny, it's cheesy, because every Muslim woman who seems like she's a threat to white supremacy and white fragility is going to make her way into these platforms. And it follows a script, like literally it follows a script. Massachusetts attorney so-and-so with connections to such and such. It follows a script. And so since we can predict what they're going to do, we have to be able to predict our response. And so I had already, by virtue of the work that we did, had put together a coalition. And so the community was able to strike back. And we knew that we could warn the constituents in Western Massachusetts, where I was running, that this threat would manifest itself unlike anything they've ever seen before. And it took so much energy. Now, I know that Jetpack is one of the partners to tonight's program, and Mohammed Missouri, who's the executive director there, spent a lot of time with me, sometimes crying, like sitting in my car crying, saying, what is happening? And he and his colleagues would coach us through how to respond and not to give up, because it is completely demoralizing, it is hurtful, and it's dangerous. And again, in 2015, which Muslim advocates had said at the time that 2015 was probably one of the most bloody years in American history for American Muslims. Like, we lost our three winners because of the uptick in Islamophobia at that time. Again, let me just explain that presidential elections do bring hatred. It brings out the hatred in these people. When I told you that in 2007, that's when we first started writing cease and desist letters, like, what is this? 2007, of course, preceded the election of President Obama and the rumors around his identity as a quote unquote fake Muslim. 2015 is also special because that, of course, preceded the election of Donald Trump, who did run on an anti-Muslim platform, who did identify Muslims and quite informed for what was happening to the United States in the United States of America. He did identify Muslims as worthy of being suspicious. We, the community of Islamburg, listened with interest when at one of his rallies in 2015, President Trump was asked about these so-called no-go zones, which in the rumor mill of the online internet trash bin, Islamburg had been identified as, quote, a no-go zone. Nothing's further from the truth. And he said, oh, we've heard about that. We'll look into it. So what I would like to say in conclusion to these remarks is that elections do bring out the worst in people. And we're sitting now on the edge of our seats wondering what sort of social unrest this election is going to bring out. But we cannot sit quietly. Like, as Muslims are being attacked, you cannot sit quietly and say, I'm not going to stand up for that community because maybe I'm going to bring the ire of the racists against me. Don't sit back and let Muslims struggle. Stand up, stand in solidarity, speak out for what's right? Because the silence that we experienced initially was deafening, and we would never, ever allow other Muslims to struggle that way. And I welcome and invite others to stand up and speak out and resist. And doing talks like this, programs like this, that's one way. But we have to also incorporate it in our day-to-day lives, in our masajid, in our communities, and in our families. I recognize that as Muslims here in America, we are not monolithic, but boy, are we powerful. And as a Muslim, our prophetic model is that we stand in solidarity with people who are being attacked because of their faith. And that is not just Muslims, it is Christians, it is Jews. And we stand in solidarity with them. We check on our Muslim brothers and sisters, and we are absolutely obligated to do that. And I challenge all of us to do more and to be better in that regard.
Thank you, Tahira. I can relate to so much of that. I remember a few years ago when I was in Florida, I was attacked by Pamela Giller and all of her right-wing groups that were affiliated with her. They had hired homeless people to stand in front of our courthouse in our county with signs saying that Ghazala Salam is a terrorist. And when people would go and ask them and say, we know her and this is not true, they would say, no, you don't know. She raises money for ISIS. I mean, this is the kind of information. And they had pamphlets and giving out all this information. So it's scary. And I think a lot of Muslims don't realize or understand this type of disinformation that is impacting the community, this type of Islamophobia through Facebook and all of these other platforms that they're using to attack Muslims. So for those folks who are watching, if you know folks that are voting, and if you have any issues in your voting, text Muslim Vote to 79606. Jetpack has a 24-hour hotline to answer any questions that you may have if you're facing any issues while voting. And so text them if you have any issues. The next speaker that I would like to invite is Kristina Wilfore. And like Thenmozhi, she studies this disinformation. She is senior advisor on the Disinformation Defense Project. Kristina, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. So such powerful comments and amazing information. It's an honor to be part of this panel and to see the extent of the efforts that are being done to really deal with what I view as one of the biggest threats to democracy is the way that disinformation is used to undermine communities of color, to leave Americans divided, and to undermine the election. So that's the angle I want to provide some additional context for. The disinformation work that we've been doing with investigators and monitors and those who are pushing back on the platforms themselves has all been about how do we look at these issues in context of the 2020 election and what disinformation is intended to do. I'm going to pull up some slides if I can. Let's see. So let me just say that we have been tracking and working with lots of investigators, including Equality Labs, who is just one of the most outstanding in this topic area, investigators and advocate and activist in all of these issues. Let me grab from the start. And it's just been really a pleasure to work with everyone who has dug very deeply on these topics. So if we step back and look at the 2020 election and disinformation, there's really been 5 tactics used to undermine the election. There's really 2 campaigns going on right now. One is the traditional one, either vote for Biden, vote for Trump, vote for candidates down ballot. The second campaign is really the campaign against democracy and meant to undermine the integrity of the election. So we've seen that unfold largely through disinformation. Disinformation on the voting process itself, meant to leave voters confused about how, when, and where to vote. Post-election and even past Tuesday, it will be just as confusing in terms of the aftermath of what happened, and disinformation will spike as a effort to try to manipulate that understanding. Disinformation has been targeted in a very pernicious way, again, at communities of color, with high amount of coordinated activity and inauthentic influence campaigns behind that. It makes it very difficult when people say, well, how can we spot mis and disinformation? It is incredibly difficult to spot from the naked eye, and the role and responsibility of the platforms should be heightened in order to prevent those kinds of influence campaigns from being possible to begin with. But we've seen over and over that because hate is profitable, they are shirking their responsibilities. So this will still be a major story out of 2020 as it was in 2016. We've also now really, since the Black Lives Matter movement, seen a tremendous amount of disinformation around protests in order to paint the picture of chaos and crisis, in order to seed the idea that there's really no possible way we can hold a credible election, which is absolutely false. And bleeding into the next point is that it's really, in a very dangerous way, disinformation aimed at spurring extremist movements, inciting violence and blame, and even around protect the vote efforts we see in the last week are being talked about in extremist networks as evidence of this so-called democratic coup and the radical left, which is just an absolute manipulation of reality. So it's really left the public, I think, with this kind of response, not really knowing what's true, what's false, and how to actually have a healthy democracy after this election. The playbook that has really come at the top, which has set the tone, and not only set the tone, but activated the kind of right-wing networks that are primed to carry disinformation, is what has been tweeted out, throughout this year about different aspects of the election. And then today, again, we hear another tweet or hear another statement. I'm sure it's followed up by a tweet about Trump's interest in calling the election on Tuesday when we won't have all the votes counted. Now, I will say it's been really hard to try to work with advocates to create a different muscle memory about how we react to this type of disinformation, even if it comes at the highest office in the land. So, every kind of Trump statement, the more we actually retweet or get outraged about these ridiculous things, the more we've actually helped frame some things as being up for debate when they shouldn't be. So I think that's one additional lesson out of this. I want to highlight a couple buckets of how the disinformation on voter fraud in specifically has been organized. There has been just a tsunami amount of disinformation aimed at claims of cheating, of interference, of voting process, machine issues, We expect attacks on election officials to continue and poll workers, and then claims of ineligible voting. Tomorrow or Tuesday, we'll see a spike in that. That fourth area, interesting enough, had not been as much volume as these other areas. But the whole intent of this is to cast doubt on the integrity of the election, and to really set up the contested election scenario. So the response that we've been recommending is, of course, to report this to the platforms themselves, just to have an accountability and record. So when the Kenosha militia page was flagged 455 times and Facebook let it continue to exist, and in fact never themselves took it down, it was the organizers who took it down, having that figure out in the public by it being flagged 455 times is part of holding that accountability structure that Thenmozhi talked about too, to try to create a trail of evidence, of the harms. Let me say a little bit about and break down this cycle, the sort of stages of where we're going to be at over the next week and probably longer. This is information also that has been provided by the partner GQR that we work with, who's been doing a tremendous amount of monitoring and advice giving. And so their advice is really having us as advocates continuing to stress the importance of patience and counting every vote, rather than getting tangled in the individual claims of disinformation, to really focus on discrediting the messengers who are undermining voting, focus on their motives, not the claims themselves, and then of course holding the press accountable for reporting results in a responsible way. So we really should think in stages about next week and beyond, because we are going to be in a contested election scenario. So the sooner we sort of accept that, and it's not based on reality, it's not based on what happens on Tuesday, it's based entirely on power, as was discussed at the top of this session, that this is ultimately about power. So in addition to thinking in stages, we need to communicate in stages and communicate in a way that gives voters agency. Over the summer, we talked about all these scary election scenarios, which are unfolding, and they are in fact frightening, and they are meant to incite fear and paralysis. But when we do that, when we overemphasize scenarios, we then take the agency and choice of voter out of the mix. And I believe that the strongest wall, to defend election integrity is in the people themselves. It's not going to be necessarily in a court decision or the laws. It's actually the people who give any of this meaning. So let's just say a little bit more about this. From now until Tuesday, it's really been about winning the vote. So getting people to the polls, trying to signal patience about the full process, and really demonstrating democracy at work. Democracy has been at work in an amazing, incredible way from really this spring through Black Lives Matter movement to this election. So the kind of communication this week will be, we need to all emphasize counting all the ballots, the security of the ballot process, trust in local officials who are administering the election and overseeing the count itself, humanizing those election officials. And there's a process for working out election disputes. We've held over 250 years of elections. This election does not have to break us as a country. It's really because one contestant is trying to hold power. So we really we need to lean back on the process itself, and also emphasize that voter intimidation will be met with consequences. We do actually have an incredibly strong legal framework for that. So let's see after Tuesday till the likely weekend, it will be about helping people sort out what is going on, continuing the count. Our role as advocates will be to simplify this process, to reinforce that recounts and audits and election contests are all normal part of the process, and help us ensure that every ballot is ultimately counted. This third point here is really important because of social media and disinformation, which is not necessarily reality, as we know. The kinds of information about errors and mistakes, that is not the same as fraud. So we should really be signaling our communities also to reinforce the messages about being skeptical of widespread allegations of fraud. Accusations and claims are easy to make, but really hard to prove. By the time we get to this weekend, we'll really see the nature of what's being contested and how credible it is perceived by the public. So we really have to stay the course, give people something to do in this period. There's some great suggestions that came out of Voting Rights Lab, so that not everyone is just constantly refreshing their browser and more apt to express outrage. We need to come up with constructive ways in which we can engage. So I thought it would just be useful to run through those things. I just want to say that having worked for over 20 years now against bad guys has been my focus in the US and internationally, especially in contested elections and with authoritarians who are trying to hold power. I can say that ultimately I am hopeful. I am more positive than I am worried, because I have seen the power of people when we come together. The other side is using these tactics because they don't have real people, they don't have real movements, and they don't have values that bind us as Americans. And I believe when we can come together and express those values and fight for our voice, we in fact win in the end. So thanks for having me here tonight.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. That was so helpful because especially, as you were presenting, I was thinking about, okay, we're a couple of days away from the election. Now, what is going to happen? The biggest disinformation mouthpiece is Donald Trump. And so he's not going away, so how do we, as American citizens, protect ourselves from that kind of disinformation? And how much of a disruption is he going to be if he loses this election? Do you have any thoughts around that?
So if I knew nothing about this election and wasn't engaged in it, I would look at it from this perspective. You have one contestant who owes, as we can see from taxes that were revealed, $420 million, is personally indebted. May face legal and other consequences for his behavior after an election, and it just has a high interest in doing everything possible to stay in power because of the stakes there. So there's a high level of interest, obviously, to use any trick in his toolkit to try to get us to give up on democracy or to manipulate the system. And I think what we have to do is realize there is an actual rule of law and legal framework. Our system is going to be tested like it has never been tested before. So none of those things are a guarantee that people have to actually be behind all of these laws to make them work. I think we also have to tell our own message. So we should not be retweeting him. We should not be in shock or dismay at all of the ridiculous things and breaking of norms that will continue to come from this presidency. So we should expect more of the same. But the real question is, how do we react? How do we organize? How do we mobilize? And how do we tell our own story despite what he will do or say?
Yeah, thank you. So for the panelists, I mean, Facebook seems to be like the, biggest enabler of all of these things, so we have a question from one of our audiences. How do we differentiate between fake Facebook groups spreading disinformation? Like being Black in Arizona, it sounds good. It sounds being pro-Black, but it spreads so much disinformation among the Black community.
Real quick, Ghazala, assalamu alaikum. So we wanted to talk real quick about the Muslim community issues and how people can deal with bots and different things directly, how we recognize them, right? To go into some very practical information. So let me just share my screen real quick. So first off is really about understanding the global nature of the Muslim community, right? That Muslims get friend requests from throughout the world, and I get them like literally daily, and we may not know where those things are from or what they are. So it's really important that we understand, and before we get into that, that first and foremost, we understand that the Muslim community has been dealing now with 20 years of nonstop division and counterintelligence programs targeting our community, right? What's called COINTELPRO, the largest counterintelligence program in the history of the United States, admitted by the FBI, over 10,000 paid informants in our communities. And so the level of just constant confusion over the last 20 years, level of disinformation is already so high on the ground level. So that's why a lot of people don't understand what's happening in the day-to-day reality of the mosques and these different things, right? So it's hard to know who is who. Even, I'll give just a few really quick examples. There's a group of Muslim scholars, supposed scholars and thinkers that have been deemed the Ak right. The word Ak is an Arabic term for brother, right? The right. And basically that these people are parroting right-wing talking points. And there's one in particular named Daniel Hakikitu, who is an imam from Texas. And the level of disinformation he's putting out, literally attacking other scholars. So like Imam Omar Suleiman in particular has been attacked. A lot of female scholars like Dalia Mujahid are being attacked in ways that they're really trying to take away the credibility of people doing social justice work in the Muslim community. And there was one time in particular over the last few months where this guy, really a troll, the level of the way he goes after things, Daniel Hakikitu, he created a video about some work that we were doing at the border, this work that we call the Border Mosque, where we're partnering with our interfaith partners, the Border Church. And he just created all this disinformation saying that the imams were taking part in these, quote, pagan ceremonies and all these different things, right? And then you go into the actual video that he posted that has that has thousands of comments, and then you start clicking on the accounts, and so many of those accounts, even within that page, are themselves bots. And so real quickly, how do we? And another good example of this is that you actually, on Twitter in particular, you will have people who say that they had just converted to Islam. This is one of the recent tactics. And their account will look like this, right? Very, very average looking, some random photo that you can't recognize who the person is. You can do a reverse image search to see if the person is real or not, but the person will say they converted to Islam. They'll get thousands of retweets, and generally speaking, it'll be like a lighter skinned white woman who has said they converted to Islam, sometimes up to tens of thousands of retweets. And then all of a sudden, a couple months go by, and those accounts start putting out all this right-wing propaganda, right? And so it's really important that the community understands how we recognize these things, that they're really recent creation date, that you have the lack of personal information. The profile is super ambiguous, stolen or non-existent. And the biggest thing with the Daniel Hakikitu page is the level of divisive language, like, these fake accounts calling other Muslims, basically saying that they weren't Muslim, which, goes really far off what's normative within the Muslim community, tweeting in more than one language and engaging in multiple international narratives, and just a high level of activity, right? And so it's really important that people understand what these bot accounts are, and especially people that are taking, that are accepting friend requests from around the world. And so now I just wanted to say that quickly to talk about the level of what the Muslim community faces. We're going to bring all the panelists in now. And then with Facebook, we talked about it a bit on the first night, where Facebook actually is not approving any advertising from Muslims at all to do anything, even like normal banquets, or fundraising banquets for nonprofits. Those ads won't be approved, even if people are, Facebook has this process now where you can go in and verify that you're a human, which is good that they're doing that. But even when groups have done that, so the example we were using is the Islamic Scholarship Fund, which gives scholarships to Muslims around the country to work in the arts. They were not allowed, even though they had done that, to run ads for their banquet, right? So it's just the gross overgeneralization that anything that has to do with Islam or Muslims is political. Ghazala, I know you had a question, if you want to go back to that specific question.
No, I think in general, what can we, I mean, so many people will be watching and wanting to know, and Facebook is such a big part of so many people's social media, right? That's like, how do we protect ourselves from this? And what can we do to advocate or hold Facebook accountable, you know, as regular Facebook subscribers? What can we do?
So this is Thenmozhi. I'll take that, and I'm sure that there's other people here that would also speak to this as well. But I think it's important to know that with Facebook, you know, we are very much a very critical role in holding the platform accountable, not just for its malfeasance in the United States, but actually for the ways that it has promoted Islamophobic and genocidal agendas across the world. And we have to keep in mind that, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg are directly profiting off of Islamophobic hate speech. And so this is an American company that is registered in the United States. And so you are going to hear, particularly in 2021, after we get out of this elections window, groups like Muslim Advocates and our organization, as well as many other institutions that have been working towards platform accountability, working with Congress to basically hold Facebook accountable. And Facebook has a unique, vulnerability in the United States because it is an American registered company. So American Congress can actually do a lot towards the regulation of that company. And so when you get those like rapid response alerts that are saying, call your congressman, show up to this briefing, those are all going to be critical intervention points, because at this point, we cannot trust Facebook to actually self or course correct itself. It is going to take people's movements to do that. And so, you know, at the highest level, think of this as a structural problem, not just one troll, but a failure of the entire ecosystem whose responsibility actually lays with both Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. And the second piece is that in terms of the spread of disinformation, we ourselves, in the meantime, while we're waiting for these structural changes, we can actually be a critical factor in stopping the link of false information harming our communities and possibly like deplatforming them from democracy. So I think that, you know, that the thing that I mentioned earlier, I just want to really flag again. If you see a piece of information that triggers your spidey sense and feels off and could be dangerous or harmful to the community, before you pass it on or think you should share, reach out to an organization that's on this panel and just flag it and say, hey, I think this might not be quite correct. Can you help me find out? And, and if you're not sure, go to a fact-checking site. There are many on the internet. You can try Snopes to begin with, or ProPublica. But, being able to, think before you share is super critical, because just the distinction of that fact check could actually make sure that you're not the chain that actually allows for greater exponential sharing of that content.
That's good information. Thank you.
I would like to add just a couple things if there's a chance.
Yes.
So we working with the women's advocacy organizations. Just on Friday, they launched an ad campaign aimed at Sheryl Sandberg. So it's called, Have Our Back, and basically it makes an appeal to her, and is part of this naming and shaming tactic. And so at some point you have to look at these executives and think they have no shame, because they are ultimately running these kind of, hate platforms for money. But I do think that that is an important part of shaping some accountability. And then you also have groups like ADL, the Color of Change, and many others who came around together on the Stop Hate for Profit, which was to put an emphasis on advertisers and work on the consumer end. So advertisers are unbeknownst to them, they're in fact upholding extremism because of the way that digital advertising works. And so having advertisers take July out, and they did a boycott, Facebook that cost them over $600 million, was one indication of the power that is there to organize in order to create those pressure opportunities.
Great, thank you.
I also just real quickly wanted to say, with Facebook, or other social media platforms, it's really important to think with a level head and a critical eye. Kristina and Thenmozhi touched on this, but inflammatory material does really well on Facebook. Hate goes viral, and that's good for Facebook's bottom line. So if you see something anti-Muslim on Facebook or other platforms, they may be a bot, they may be a troll, it may be someone who genuinely feels this way, but the best thing you can do in response, regardless, is do not engage. Facebook wants you to be on their platform all day, getting madder and madder and posting and sharing. And that way you can see more advertisements. They can report to their board that these many people spend all this time on their platform. It's good for them that you're getting mad and engaging. So don't do that. As Thenmozhi says, if you see something on Facebook that is suspicious or dangerous, come to one of our groups, take a screenshot of the post, report the post, report the person, consult one of our groups who's worked on this issue and, can see whether something is dangerous, and we know who to go to.
Great. We are now coming at 6:13. We ran a little bit over, but I think this was amazing information. I don't think people, folks have any idea of how deep this disinformation industry is actually and how harmful Facebook is. So I think we definitely won't learn everything in this 1 hour, but we would love to stay connected with all of you. Because this is going to be one of the issues that we are going to take up at the Muslim Caucus Education Collective, because no matter who wins this election, all of these issues, are not going away. That's why we're hosting this 5-day series of panels to talk about these important things that are not going to go away. And we have to organize at a grassroots level, educate our community to, so that they are more informed and take proactive actions against all of these things that are marginalizing us, that are eroding at our democracy, and just expanding the hate even more than it is. So we want to thank you, both Jetpack, Center for Global Muslim Life, and Muslim Caucus Education Collective. We thank you all for joining us this evening, and we will stay in touch with you guys. Thank you.